Hey, Justine. Good afternoon, everyone. As we get folks into the room, my name is Corey Cantor. I'm an electric vehicle associate here at Bloomberg NEF. I'm excited to welcome our panelists here today. We're going to be talking about the electric bus sector, from both transit buses, of which there are over 670,000 buses worldwide, to the emerging electric school bus sector, of which in the US is just beginning and around the world to populate our streets. So I'm really excited to welcome our panelists here. We've got, from my far right, Pierre Blanc, the Chief Technological Industrial Officer at Leclanché. We got Zoheb Daver, the Head of Business Development at the Mobility House. We got Claire Mcconnell, the VP of Strategic Partnerships at Proterra, and Justine Chow, a Senior Project Manager at Southern California Edison. Really excited to have all of you on the panel today. Thanks to everyone for hanging out till the end of the summit. I know a lot of folks are really interested in electric buses, so we're going to cover all aspects of the bus and commercial vehicle sector. So I think to start off, though, let's hear a little bit more about you guys. We're going to start with Pierre. Maybe give me a minute on what you do at your company, as well as your role in the kind of broader commercial vehicle space.
Thank you very much. So Leclanché is a battery manufacturer, quite an old battery manufacturer. I think we're celebrating our 113th year.
Happy anniversary.
So we've been around for some time. Not always doing lithium-ion batteries, but today we focus on lithium-ion batteries, and mainly on batteries for heavy-duty applications, which cover marine applications, so quite present in the marine, railway, and then road transportation, which covers heavy-duty trucks, but also some buses, mainly in the European market today. And within the company, I overview all of the technology and all of the production sites. So overview everything that needs to be delivered in principle.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Zoheb?
Hi, everyone. I'm Zoheb Davar. A lot of people call me Zo. Thank you all for staying, because I think this is a really important sector, and we'll get into that. I work for a company called the Mobility House, where I lead business development and growth. The Mobility House is based in Munich, Germany, but launched operations in the US a few years ago. It's been around for 13 years, and we are a charging and energy management software provider. So the idea was to bring the lessons and the learnings and experience and technology from Europe, which is a market that's a few years ahead, here to the US, and we've mainly been operating in the school and transit markets.
Great. Claire?
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Mcconnell. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Proterra. I specifically focus on our Proterra-powered business, which takes our core technology that we have developed initially for our transit buses and leverages that to help other commercial vehicle applications electrify their platforms. We've announced 15 partnerships to date in everything from electric construction equipment to electric school buses to electric delivery trucks, and hopefully more to come. And I agree with Zoe that we're happy that you all stayed, because we believe commercial vehicles are a really important sector to focus on electrification. So thank you all.
Great. Thanks, Claire. All right, Justine?
Great. Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Justine Chow, and I manage Southern California Edison's Charge Ready Transport program, which is a 5-year program that we launched in 2019 that aims to address some of the key cost and complexity barriers that are associated with the design and installation of EV charging infrastructure for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Through the program, we are providing low to no-cost make-ready infrastructure that supports EV charging equipment for our commercial customers that are deploying at least 2 medium or heavy-duty electric vehicles. We're aiming to support the electrification of nearly 8,500 medium and heavy-duty EVs. And so I'm responsible for overseeing our overall project pipeline and daily operations to ensure that we're supporting our sites and achieving those overall goals. Some of our earliest deployments were school and transit projects, and as my colleagues have said on the stage, the zero-emission bus segment continues to play a great role in helping our communities transition to a cleaner energy future. So really glad to be here, and thank you all for staying to talk more about our experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Justine. And I think I'm hearing more and more about how commercial vehicles are a topic of conversation at the summit, we've talked a lot about passenger vehicles, but electric buses have really been scaling up over time, mainly in the Chinese market, but in the US and in Europe. And I hope our conversation here will be focusing not only on the transit bus space, but on that school bus space as well. A quick story, and then I'm going to turn to Claire first, but I was in LA for a conference in kind of the city center, and we saw a bunch of great transit buses driving around. I'm like, oh, it's an interesting design. Are those electric buses? Are they not electric buses? Turns out they were. And of all the companies that make electric buses, they were Proterra buses. And all the folks at the kind of panel said how well the kind of bus experience on the transit side has been so far, and not having kind of some of the issues that maybe other commercial vehicles are having as they are just scaling up for different use cases. So I do have a question on how are kind of things going at Proterra in terms of the core business. What's changed over the last year or so, and how are you feeling about how the company is doing on that front?
Yeah, and first of all, I'd like to start off and say that I'm glad you had a good experience with our transit bus. That's always good to hear, good customer feedback. So things are going well at Proterra. It was a busy year last year. We announced 7 new partnerships with Proterra-powered customers, and for me, that was pretty exciting, given that's my business. So we announced partnerships in everything from construction equipment with Komatsu to mining equipment with Komatsu. We announced a partnership with Volta Trucks, and then we've announced just this month, actually, a partnership with Nikola. So we're really seeing that commercial vehicles are going electric, and it is accelerating the speed at which these vehicles are transitioning. Certainly also a big year for us more broadly as a company. We went public, and that was an exciting change for the company overall. And we're really excited to have that support to better grow the business overall.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up just on kind of that, not the necessarily going public, but just more and more people learning about Proterra and the EV space overall. Have you found that kind of change in your time, or particularly over the last year? Because yeah, there are more companies out there than just your big passenger EV folks that we've discussed a lot during the conference.
Yeah, definitely. People are starting to be more aware of electric commercial vehicles. I've been in the electric vehicle space for a little over a decade now, and with Proterra for almost 5 years. And in the time that I've joined Proterra, we've definitely seen in the past 5 years, especially, a lot of progress in terms of vehicle manufacturers taking electrification a lot more seriously and committing to electrify their platform. So it's not just one-off pilots anymore. They're actually looking for production electric vehicles as well.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Turning to Justine, you talked a little bit about the role that Southern California Edison is playing in terms of building that backbone of infrastructure. So I want to ask you to tell our audience here about the Charge Ready program, and how does someone qualify, and what sorts of programs are in place currently on the transit bus side?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Charge Ready Transport is our program here at Southern California Edison that we offer to our commercial customers who are deploying at least 2 medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. And so, we've got our sister utilities that also have their own medium and heavy duty fleet programs as well. But this is our way to support our commercial customers, with charging infrastructure. I think, we've seen SCE's Pathway 2045 white paper that looks at what the state needs to do in order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And we see that, at least, a third of heavy duty vehicles and 2/3 of medium duty vehicles need to be electric in order to achieve those goals. And so I think we view our role as the utility to really help customers that are acquiring these vehicles kind of navigate some of those challenges that can arise when you're looking to install and deploy charging infrastructure. And so the program was designed to support those customers. And so we provide make-ready infrastructure. And by that, what I mean is infrastructure on the distribution side that actually works, to cover the costs of the service drop, the meter, the panel, and the circuits that are dedicated to EV charging. And so We will install all of the necessary infrastructure on both the utility side and the customer side of the meter, up to the interconnection point with the customer's charging stations. And so customers can also perform their side of the meter work and receive a rebate if they choose. So we have kind of two paths of participation, but it's really intended to provide that make-ready infrastructure that enables customers to hook up their charging stations and make their vehicles operational.
Great. Thank you, Justine. All right. We're going to switch to Pierre for a second because Europe is a bit ahead of the US as it pertains to electric buses. Depending on what numbers you guys are looking at, the US is somewhere between, according to our numbers, about 1,800 electric transit buses with about 3,000 orders on the way. Europe is over 7,000 in terms of electric buses. And so you guys got a little bit of experience to maybe share with us. So my question to you is, in your role, how do you see the European transit bus market? And what sort of challenges have you seen in the early days, but also opportunities for folks?
Well, I think in Europe, the conditions are somewhat different than in the US. First of all, from the energy cost point of view, and that does play a role in some of the decisions. Also, every European country is slightly different, but you do see a lot of electrification already existing in the European market through trolley buses, right, which are in place. So a lot of the projects that we see going into place in, whether it be Switzerland, Czech Republic, or other places, the battery-driven buses are more for applications where the overhead power lines cannot be put in place. So it's an infrastructure question rather than going to electric, because they are already electric. So it's a different driver. Now, it's not the case everywhere. There are countries where they do use diesel-driven. But when you see the cost of fuel and the cost of electricity, there is a much better case to calculate the payback on an electric bus than in other regions. So I think there are some different drivers. You also have still a lot of learning going on. I think Europe, you will see a mix of battery applications with large batteries for full-day operation. You also see cities implementing fast charge within the routes. Which one is the best solution? I don't know. I don't think anybody does know at this stage. But there is still a lot of learning going on to see what could be the most cost-effective solution and easiest to implement. Obviously, when you start changing infrastructure, at least in Europe, it's a very heavy process. Changing power lines in towns, putting in charging stations in cities is not something simple from a permitting point of view. So all of these factors are drivers that will be very different in the US.
Great. All right. So have you kind of have the Europe and US experience here? You're going to bring it together and connect the two continents. How does the Mobility House kind of interact with the transit bus space? What lessons have you guys drawn from Europe, and how do you see the early US market in that segment?
Yeah, thanks for connecting those two dots. I think the biggest lesson is for the EV industry at large, rather than just transit. And I would say this, that it's very difficult for us to comprehend what exponential growth means. In Europe, I've seen over the past year the upward pressure that the market is putting on our company to grow. And it's helpful to really conceptualize it with this thought experiment that we did with our management team, which is, bnef, I should say, has done really good work to do projections in the past 5+ years, where they've been realizing there's going to be exponential growth, whereas other agencies will show linear growth. So bnef has really showed that, hey, there's going to be an inflection point. And if you boiled those numbers down, bnef says there's going to be 28 million EVs in the US by 2030. So if you project one EV charger per EV, which is conservative because there'll be an EV charger at home, and then at work, and then at the grocery store, and so on. But let's just say a 1-to-1 ratio, so 28 million EV chargers by 2030. So that means in the next 8 years, we need to install 10,000 chargers every single day from now till 2030. So when you think about those numbers, it's like, how are we going to do this? We need more people in this industry. The competition doesn't really exist right now. Right now, we're not at that inflection point in the US. We're going to see that in a year or so. And so we think of it right now as a strategy of partnering and figuring out your offering with your partners such that it's seamless to the end user so that they have a good, simple, comprehensive system that works as planned. And so right now, we've learned, I've learned from seeing the growth on the other side of the pond that right now it's about working with the partners, doing projects, and figuring out the learnings from those projects, coming across those challenges, and having good partners where you figure it out together, because that's what it's all about, such that in a year or 2 years, you're able to handle the growth that's coming.
I think to your point on that, it's been in that kind of pilot phase of trying to figure things out, and then how do you go from pilot to production level of, okay, we procured one transit bus or a few transit buses, have those partners, and now take that next step. That I think a lot of cities and states in the US are trying to figure out, but you've seen success elsewhere. And I think those are all the optimistic views. Pierre, I don't want to ask you to play too pessimistic here, but I do think it's important to talk about the supply chain. We had in our conversation before the BNF Summit just some talks around what challenges there might be in terms of having enough battery materials to supply a bus segment over time. So just curious if you could expand on your thoughts about how if you think the bus sector will be able to kind of deal with scaling up, or if it's going to run into any challenges on the battery supply side.
Well, today the big driver for growth is the automotive industry, and they are the big battery manufacturers, cell manufacturers, where a lot of the constraints on materials are and will be, are diverting whatever they can to the automotive industry. So you will see, and we're seeing, factories being built up, capacity coming online, constraint going down, and then demand continuing to go up and constraints reappearing. And it's continuous, and I think it will continue for a long time. I think for the bus industry, and at least in Europe, what people are trying to do is to have as much local production as possible. I think Europe has announced more capacity installation in the coming 10 years than China. So they are aiming, again, it still needs to be executed, aiming to install a lot of capacity to support all of the industries that will need storage, electrochemical storage at least, in transportation and implementation of renewable energy. So that is the whole ecosystem that needs to be addressed. And this is putting a lot of pressure on the supply chain, pushing for alternative sources of raw materials. There's a lot of development going on for mining in Europe, getting some of the raw materials, the lithium, the cobalt, from European sources and not depending on African or Chinese sources.
And I think to that last point, and as some of our other panels have shown over the summit, that kind of planning and thinking across the supply chain is going into effect. And it will take some time, but given that there are limited sources of materials right now, a lot of folks are looking for ways to open those minds and hopefully lower the cost over time, which will have an impact on the bus segment. And given that there are less kind of turnover or less buses to actually replace in each of the individual countries versus passenger vehicle market, which is quite large. On the kind of thinking around long timelines, Justine, I want to bring you in. We talked a little bit about best practices for folks in the bus sector in terms of thinking ahead and planning smartly with charging infrastructure. Can you share some thoughts on maybe the best practices on charging for transit buses?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And, we've learned quite a bit, to Zoe's point about taking lessons learned, we've learned quite a bit about school and transit operations, and how to efficiently design utility distribution infrastructure to accommodate for future expansion, which is, was and still very much is a big area of focus for us at the utility. And in deploying a number of these school and transit bus projects specifically, we know that developing solid electrification plans really requires an understanding of three key items. One is the vehicles themselves, the charging equipment, and a customer's timeline. And so customers that come to us and to our program really prepared with information on those three aspects tend to move more expeditiously through our program. I think that to determine kind of what's needed in each of those areas, operational needs and route cycles should really be driving vehicle and charging equipment selection. And that informs, the broader infrastructure requirements and our designs at a site. The best charger size is usually the smallest kilowatt that can allow the vehicles to be operational based on the intended use and route cycles. And the reason that we kind of say that is because it keeps costs low, really reduces the equipment that's needed and the quantity and the overall footprint, which is also something to think about with commercial deployments. Lastly, I think most companies are not looking to electrify their entire fleet overnight, but instead they'll look at phasing in a number of EVs over time. And that's a great approach, especially if additional utility capacity is needed in order to meet those full-scale electrification plans. And so today, SCE as a utility really looks to partner with our fleet customers, those in the transit space and the bus space and others in the MDHD space, to develop some of those shorter and longer term plans that can address the immediate electrification needs while also building out capacity solutions for the longer term kind of full scale deployment. And so early engagement, I know you've heard this probably quite a bit during the summit, but early engagement with the utility is really key. And I think that's a theme that we'll continue to see moving forward as something that we need in order to plan and meet those capacity requirements over time.
Right. Yeah, early engagement you're hearing a lot about with utilities, making sure it's on the radar, and also long-term planning. And I think to point on the kind of 10-year, 20-year out, California as a state has a 2040 full 100% zero emission fleet target. Other countries are looking at 2030 and beyond. So really getting in earlier and beginning that process and thinking about today, having the conversations like we're having here is quite important. But the bus sector is broader than just transit buses. Claire, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit more about the partnerships and particularly Proterra Power. Why did Proterra expand beyond that kind of core function? And tell us a little bit more about what Proterra Power does, how you work with utilities and other stakeholders or your other kind of bus partners in that expansion process.
Yeah, so we believe the commercial vehicle market is ripe for electrification more broadly, and we believe that Proterra is uniquely qualified to help commercial vehicle manufacturers electrify their platforms. We started with transit because we believed it would be one of the first commercial vehicle categories to go zero emission, and we're seeing that play out. I think it's Frost & Sullivan who projects by 2025, 50% of all transit bus purchases will be electric. So it's coming. We wish it would come even faster than that, but it's coming. The reason we focused on, or the reason we thought transit would go electric first is that a lot of the characteristics of transit buses make it really compelling for electrification from a total cost of ownership perspective. Transit buses have high annual mileage. They go about 35,000 miles per year. They have poor fuel efficiency and they go in circular routes. All of that makes the economic case for an electric vehicle quite compelling. So the characteristics, though, also are very rugged and can be carried over well to other commercial vehicle categories. Proterra has designed our batteries from the ground up to serve commercial vehicles. The high annual mileage, 35,000 plus miles per year, rather than a passenger car that the battery might be designed for something more like 12,000 miles per year. And then a harsh urban environment. And beyond that, we are also experienced with vehicle electrification. So we take our batteries and we put them into our own transit buses, and we know how to design a vehicle. And we can work with our OEM partners in a variety of ways. We don't have to just be a battery supplier. We can also help with that vehicle electrification journey. The last reason we focused on it is that commercial vehicle electrification, it's super important from a climate standpoint. Transportation is one of the leading sources of emissions in North America, and heavy duty vehicles contribute disproportionately to that, and as some of you have already talked about, it often gets overlooked. So I'm glad we're all talking about it today.
Yeah, I think that's the one message of our second day of our summit, which is really a lot of folks got to be in the commercial and heavy duty space to really work on those climate issues and help, exchange best practices and also build those partnerships. Because, we put out a long-term electric vehicle outlook and we see many of the, whether it's transit buses or passenger vehicles, hitting over 50% EV share of sale over the next 2 decades, but medium and heavy commercial vehicles are going to take that intervention by policymakers or the private sector to get there because they currently aren't not on track for that kind of net zero world. So all good things to be working on. So last question I'm going to put before we kind of go to broad panel topics. We talked a little about in our conversation about areas outside of California where you have experience, Mobility House has experience of working on electric transit buses that might surprise some of the folks here. These are states and use cases that go beyond what folks might hear about. So just curious about case studies that you might want to share with the group on the kind of electrification of commercial vehicles.
Sure. And I should say the reason why we've started in the US in the bus space is for the reasons you mentioned, Claire. Has an outsized impact. We are talking about big batteries here, and therefore you can make a real impact with charging and energy management. If you don't use that, your electricity costs can get out of hand. But as Chelsea Sexton said yesterday, who she started on the GM1, and which, by the way, her along with Claire, I think it's fantastic that this industry has many female pioneers, which is awesome. That's unlike legacy industries. But anyways, she said yesterday, you can't adopt something where there's no product. And so in the US, we found that there's funding available for school and transit buses, and there are vehicles available. So that's also been a reason why we've been in that space. And it's provided this sort of test bed for different partners. We've been working with New Flyer a lot on the transit side, and we've been able to understand, okay, how does the bus interact with the charging energy management system and the charger. In one situation was in St. Louis, where they're using New Flyer buses, the Mobility House charging and energy management platform, and then ABB depot and pantograph chargers. And at the time when it went in the ground, it was the largest by power capacity in the US of 4.35 megawatts. And the interesting thing is we're seeing more and more of these crop up around the US, but a lot of them are outside of California, which is fantastic because we're now seeing these communities that could be underserved or overlooked by the Teslas who created a strategy to serve more affluent folks up front. Now these folks are being served with transit and school buses like in St. Louis, across Canada, in Brookville in Maryland, in Knoxville, in all sorts of places, which is really fantastic. And so I think that's very interesting, and it also sets the stage for further innovation, such as V2X. So in school buses, there's potential because of the duty cycles for vehicle to grid, where the school buses can be assets to the grid, soaking up the cheap renewable energy when it's available, putting it back on the grid. With transit buses, as you said, they drive a lot of miles, so there's not a ton of time to put that energy back on the grid. However, they can be resiliency assets. And we're talking to folks like in Charlotte, where we have our system that's being installed to operate the buses there, that they've been hit hard by hurricanes. And at that time, they lose power for a week, 2 weeks. And these giant batteries can now be assets for resiliency and put power back onto that building where they can get operations going. So it's very interesting that things are now happening outside of California, which is fantastic because that's really what's going to accelerate this industry.
Great, thanks, Zoe. And that's actually the perfect launching point as we go into kind of panel-wide discussion on beyond the transit bus. So you gave me school buses. I'm going to maybe start with Claire, but I want to throw out a fact for everyone in the audience because I think it is useful. We do at bnef a ton of research on electric buses. In the US, there are about 72,000 transit buses, right? The ones you see in your city centers. But there are 500,000 school buses. So more than a 5 times larger of a market, just getting started in terms of the focus here. Claire, can you talk a bit about the school bus market here in the US and Proterra's work on school buses what are the challenges and opportunities for folks? I think it's pretty exciting given that I'm sure many of us went to school on a school bus, had diesel fumes being inhaled, probably didn't think what it was doing to us, but had to go to school anyway. So, just one benefit there of electrifying.
Yeah, certainly. I think we can all agree that school bus electrification school bus is a great market to focus on for electrification. These are the vehicles that are driving our children around to schools, so reducing the amount of diesel exhaust that they are exposed to should be a priority for us as we think about vehicle electrification. Outside of that, it is a very large market, as Corey alluded to. About 40,000 school buses are sold per year as compared to 5,000 to 6,000 transit buses here in North America. So quite a large market and important cargo on board. In addition to that, school buses, as Zoe was mentioning earlier, are actually one of the best use cases we can think of for vehicle to grid. School buses are driven on average 200 days per year, and on those days they operate about 6 hours per day. And the times that they're not driving actually often coincide with utility peak periods. So early evenings, summer months, school buses are often idle. And that provides a great opportunity for a school bus battery to deliver energy back to the grid when utilities need it most and help the municipalities better monetize that school bus battery and make the economics of purchasing an electric school bus better. We're seeing some really good early progress in vehicle to grid on the school bus side. Proterra powered electric school bus in our partnership with Thomas Built Buses actually provided energy back to the grid in Massachusetts last summer for over 50 hours. And then we're doing some early work with Virginia and in Michigan as well on vehicle to grid.
Great, thanks, Clara. And on the grid part, I want to bring Justine in here, both on the school bus side, and then if you want to comment on vehicle to grid, but maybe first talk a little bit about what SE is doing on school buses in particular, and how many, are you seeing a lot of uptake there? Is it still more balanced on the transit side in terms of usage of your programs? Or is the school bus market about to take off and folks are needing to look even more into it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think some of the earliest charge-ready transport site deployments were school bus deployments, although we've completed various transit projects as well. And I think there were likely a few reasons that we saw some early successes with schools that my panelists have mentioned. I know Zoe commented on funding availability. I think Claire mentioned the use case being ideal, that cleaner and quieter transportation for students really is a positive use case. And, I think also just the fact that, availability of those buses coupled with grant funding coincided really nicely with the launch of our program. And so that's enabled, I think, most of our school buses and school district actors to take advantage of the program early on. That said, I think transit technology is, well established, and as Claire mentioned, I think the route cycles are very predictable. We do have, a fair number of transit agencies participating in our program. I think currently we see more school district participation in the program than transit agencies, but our program, does have a minimum requirement that we spend 15% of our infrastructure budget on transit agency deployments. And so, we're looking forward to continuing to support that sector as well, both sectors moving forward. Great to hear some of the early successes that, my colleagues are mentioning in vehicle to grid. I think some folks, if they chimed into Katie Sloan's panel yesterday, heard her mention, that we are thinking about the vehicle to grid integration landscape. And right now we're seeing this kind of roll out in 3 phases with 3 frontiers. I think the first being some of those traditional more V1G type use cases that include load management tools, things like time of use rates, et cetera. And we've seen some good success there. I think the next use case that Zoe had mentioned was focusing on vehicle to building and applications for resiliency. And then finally, that V2G application for offering grid services as being that third and final frontier. I think our experience to date, we haven't seen too many customers requesting that V2G functionality just yet. Most of the customers that we've been dealing with in our program are currently focused on some of the initial deployments where they're focused on full operability of their new EVs, and they're working towards established use cycles and dwell time modeling. And so we've been focused on helping them with those initial deployments, but likely more discussion down the road on V2G once we get those established use cases and cycles and dwell time modeling.
I definitely think there'll be a lot of discussion about V2G. Pretty much every conference, especially around buses, there's always the open question and proponents and opponents. I think more proponents, and maybe it's slight skepticism of when it'll happen, less so than overall skepticism. Pierre, I want to give you a chance if there's anything you want to add on either school buses or V2G, or we can move on to the next topic.
No, I think looking at the US market, the investment in the school bus can't be paid back without some alternative revenue that needs to be generated in some way. So I think this battery to grid, vehicle to grid, is going to be an important component in making school buses, electric school buses, viable. Without that, the use case is simply too low. I shouldn't be saying this, but batteries are an expensive component, a very expensive component of the vehicle. And if it's to have that component unused, it's a very difficult investment to make. So having these alternative revenue streams will, I think, considerably help the implementation and development of these markets. So it's very important.
Speaking of alternative revenue streams, I want to talk a little bit about policy. In my former life, I was a Senate staffer, and we had a policy panel earlier today. So always a part of the revenue conversation or the decarbonization conversation. I want to ask the panel, their overall thoughts on the infrastructure bill. There are billions of dollars for both charging infrastructure and towards both electric school buses and transit buses. Is this enough to kind of get the industry rolling, or is there more you guys want to see from policymakers to kind of help expedite the growth and adoption of electric school buses or transit buses or commercial vehicles writ large? I think so. I'll start with you on this one, and then as folks want to chime in on the policy question, feel free. So maybe going to throw it to you, give you maybe the hard or easy question, depending on how you think about it.
Sure. I am more an on-the-ground type person, so I'm not super focused on what's coming down the pike, although I have an eye on it, so that way I can know who's going to have funding and help them out. And I will say that even with funding for a bus, you still need resources as a school. There's a driver shortage right now. Already, without the driver shortage, schools have minimal resources. We actually helped electrify one of the school districts in Southern California with the help of Justine's team in the Charge Ready program. And that was a major boon because they were the resource that the school district could use. Otherwise, without them, if you just have money for a bus, who's going to do it? Who's going to figure out the planning that we all talk about? But I will say that it's fantastic that there is money coming down the pike for this. It has an outsized effect on students' lives because it's at a young age. They're not breathing the fumes, like Claire said. I mean, the phrase is something like the path to hell is lined with good intentions. I've been talking to school directors of transportation a lot, and I'm like, yeah, like how about we go electric? There's financing partners. You can talk with different programs, so on and so forth. And they're like, well, I hear there's money coming down the pike, so I'm just going to wait for that. It's like, no, that's not the intention. The intention is to electrify now and don't wait. But so it's good, but there are nuances to it.
Right. And I think there's been a lot of conversation in renewable energy writ large of the chicken and the egg, or do you wait another year for an incentive or get the ball rolling and grow that economies of scale here in the US to lessen the cost of buses so other people can also be able to afford buses. It's that push and the pull with the supply chain and policy to kind of influence it. But it's always a kind of give and take, I think. Claire, any thoughts on the infrastructure bill? Good, what you want to see more of?
Yeah, we were really excited to see the infrastructure bill pass at the end of last year with $39 billion dedicated to public transit and over $4 billion dedicated to zero-emission buses specifically. On top of that, an unprecedented amount of funding for electric school buses. certainly good news for electrification of buses overall, so we were happy to see that. We do think that more needs to be done, and we hope that state and federal lawmakers continue to react and prioritize the climate crisis at the speed at which we're seeing it occur.
Right. Justine, I want to turn to you both on the federal infrastructure bill, but also California state policy, what the kind of legislators are doing to encourage e-bus adoption here, and how you guys are able to use the infrastructure bill funds, or maybe more work that needs to be done in that space.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we've seen and had in the past, even prior to the infrastructure bill and some of these state policies coming forward, we've had many participants that have leveraged vouchers from the hybrid and zero emission truck and bus voucher incentive project, HVIP, or additional CEC or quality management district grant funding to help offset the costs of zero emissions battery electric buses. In terms of Charge Ready Transport program funding, it's been a program that was approved by the California Public Utilities Commission. And so in that sense, our overall kind of program funding for infrastructure that we have has been set. But I would say that moving forward regarding funding and additional funding that's coming down the pike, it is really important and helpful for the utilities to know where that funding is being targeted so that we can address some of those grid concerns intelligently and not randomly. And so I would say, greater insight and transparency into kind of the direction of that funding would be very helpful.
Great. Thanks, Justine. And Pierre, last to turn to you, both on the U.S. market, is the policy going to help make it more attractive? And then I guess not to throw a second question on you there, but in Europe, have you seen any successful kind of policy usage to kind of aid the bus market further along that maybe the folks can bring over here?
I think these policies on support are a double-sided sword. They do help bring companies to a certain scale, but I think where we need to be very careful is in getting to that scale, we need to go through the process of optimization, cost reduction, and policies, or too much free money can reduce the efforts made to achieve that. And once you cut the subsidies, it's no longer viable. So I think you need this. You really do need it to kickstart an industry, but you have to be careful. You have to be careful. You saw in a complete different industry, but in Germany with the solar industry, the subsidies killed the German industry because they developed, and when they had to do it on their own, well, Chinese bought them, and it was finished. So, these are industries where we need to reach a level of competitivity without the subsidies. And the subsidies need to be there to help the companies get there and not to hide the forest, put it like that. Now, I think it's a very good initiative. I think everybody needs to be very careful how it's used so that the real goal is reached and that it's not just going to hide a lack of competitivity and a lack of real application for these technologies.
Great. Thanks, Pierre. And a kind of follow-up question, slightly shifting topics a little bit. We talked about this a little bit in our pre-call about, where is battery electric the best use for some of these buses? If we have to decarbonize everything, right, that maybe using alternative fuels might be a good option for folks. Kind of a line of, not just spending money to spend money by policymakers or cities or such.
Yeah, I think there are a number of presentations and panels throughout the last couple of days on this as well. Electrification is one avenue of decarbonization. Batteries are one part of it. There are other ways, fuel cells, there are other solutions. I don't believe there is one solution that fits all. You are going to see battery-driven, you're going to see hybrid-driven, you're going to see natural gas. You're going to see a combination to meet the different requirements of the different applications. You're going to see fleet operators in cities which have routes that change frequently. It might be difficult for them to use purely battery-driven because they might not be able to plan the same way. They might not have the same flexibility with their fleet. This will be part of their decision making. You have, at least in Europe, or Switzerland, I'll say for Switzerland at least, the air pollution is one aspect, noise pollution is another one. So going to electric-driven vehicles is part of the noise reduction, not only the gas emissions. So there are a number of considerations that are taken into play, and there will be a number of solutions to address it. I don't believe it's one solution fits all, and I don't, talking as a battery person, but I don't believe the battery will solve all the problems.
Battery will solve a lot of the problems. No, exactly. And I think you touch on a key point, which we touched a bit on today's panel, but maybe, it's not fully in the passenger vehicle space, but it's the lack of, or the improvement on noise pollution, or the, improvement on health benefits here. I do want to talk about equity for a moment, because I think the bus space, whether you're talking school bus, transit bus, is really important for reaching folks who might not be able to afford a passenger car. And so I think, this is an area of which, whether you're just focusing on electrification to kind of help on the decarbonization side, there is an equity component here that makes the bus sector unique. I'm going to start with Justine on just, your thoughts on the equity that both electric school and transit buses can provide, and then we'll open up to the other three panelists just if they have any thoughts on the equity piece.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really important that we bring all of our communities along in the transition in order to successfully achieve our clean energy future. I think with transit and school buses, we have a great opportunity to electrify other modes of transportation, as my colleagues have said, for customers who are not in the passenger duty car segment. And, it provides an opportunity to improve air quality and reduce noise in the communities that these buses are serving. If I zoom in a little bit selfishly to talk about charge-ready transport, the program was designed to ensure that infrastructure deployments do not just take place in a few areas in our service territory or cater strictly to large fleet owners and operators. I think at least 40% of our infrastructure budget of this program will go to sites that are located in disadvantaged communities, which helps ensure that the program caters to the needs of our broader customer base. And so we're actively working with bus fleets that are in the high desert, Central Valley, the metropolitan areas of LA, and some of the coastal communities along with the Inland Empire. And so I think that showcases the broad range of geographies and communities that we support. And included in that mix are both, large fleets and smaller agencies, that are working to electrify. And so we're striving to support the range of customers that ensure a more equitable distribution of deployments. And we do view that as paramount in the transition.
Thanks, Justine. Anyone else want to get to the equity point? Yeah, go for it, Claire.
I'll touch on it a little bit, and I completely agree with what Justine said about school buses and transit buses providing clean, quiet transportation for communities that might not have access to often luxury passenger cars. So that's certainly important and something that we are happy to be able to work on. In addition to that, though, commercial vehicles, other types of commercial vehicle emissions often disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities. So you can think about port trucks, for example, drayage, the areas surrounding ports. So those are often inhabited by disadvantaged communities. And then long-haul trucks, also the emissions from those also disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities. So we're really happy to be tackling commercial vehicles and working on that problem as well.
Yeah, and I'll add one point, because DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a point that's pretty near and dear to the culture of the Mobility House. And we mentioned that students shouldn't be breathing in fumes and having an outsized impact on their lives by going electric, and then you have the dual impact in the transit industry of, low-income people are the types of people in the U.S. who need the buses, and so you're helping facilitate them and without breathing fumes, as well as low-income areas are typically around the corridors, as Claire mentioned. And another thing that's interesting is that I've been on these sites and seen how implementation and commissioning happens. And what happens is something very interesting. So actually a SoCal Edison Charge Ready program, 4 chargers go into a school, And as the chargers are getting online and things are coming into commissioning, I'm seeing the custodian staff come out and look at the chargers and seeing things like, oh, the kilowatt hour is different than kW. Okay, I understand. And so that exposure is what will accelerate this industry. The folks in these types of communities that understand the vehicles from a hands-on standpoint, then go home and talk to their wives and children and say, like, yeah, I learned about this thing, are now more open to buying these EVs when they're available at the $20,000 price point, tax credits and stuff like that. So it's not just good for society in a DEI standpoint, it's actually good business too.
Great. Anything else you want to add, Pierre, or if not?
No, I think just to add to what the other panelists have said, you know, tackle the problem where it is, not where it's the most convenient to do it. You know, the lower revenue areas are most often the ones that have the highest levels of pollution. Those are the ones who need the solution first. I think as a society, it's also the responsibility of everyone to address that problem. In the end, pollution doesn't stop at the borders of an area. I mean, it affects us all. So we need to address the issue where it is, and not just where it's convenient for us.
And I think all of you guys have made key points there around what's so exciting about the commercial vehicle space. You know, it's all around us, whether it's a dredge truck or a garbage truck or the electric school bus or a transit bus. There's a lot of ways that different companies can fill the gaps in, help their business, but also help the kind of overall community here, which is very exciting for the sector. And I'm sure in the bnef summits in the years ahead, there'll be even more of a commercial vehicle focus, which is great. Folks in the audience, we're getting close to the end here. So if you have any questions, send them into our app. I do want to ask and end for me on a fun one, which is really, you know, we've had a long conference, a lot of interesting predictions and insights. What are you guys looking forward to or looking for in the next 12 months? Maybe Pierre, we'll start with you, of, you know, whether it's the commercial vehicle space or if you want to even throw in a last passenger, you know, EV. What's the, you know, the thing you're most looking to watch in the next 12 months?
No, I think over the last few years we've seen a large development of the passenger EV, with a lot of resources put into it, a lot of large companies involved in building up. You know, some startup companies who grew, but now you're seeing the large OEMs really kicking in and really building up their capacity. But I think what's exciting now is to see that there are a lot of other areas that are maybe a little bit later. We're involved in marine, we're involved in railway, but these areas are also starting now to ramp up. They are behind the curve compared to the automotive, but I do think in the next 12 to 24 months we're going to see a rapid increase in these areas, and they will be addressing also a large part of the emissions. And I think this is going to be a very interesting area to follow, which is maybe not as visible for the public because, you know, it's not, you don't buy a car or you don't buy a vessel or you don't buy a train, and you might not even know that it's electric, but you know, it will have a large impact.
Yeah, and that's one thing before we move on to the rest of you guys that we talked about in our call, which is, you know, the electric maritime space and ferries, which I think is kind of cool. And you know, maybe something in a couple of years we'll see even more and more of those ferries. You probably won't even know, like you said, that you're riding in one. It'll just be like a normal ferry.
Well, yeah, they are more quiet. So that's a bit of a giveaway. But I think, you know, they do bring a lot of benefits. They, at least in certain areas of application. You know, the solution again is not viable for all applications today, but they will bring improvements in terms of air quality. It's important for large ports, but also in smaller villages, smaller towns where the port pollution can have pretty large effect on the rest of the population. So I think these are going to be very interesting aspects, and they are becoming commercially available today without any subsidies. So you know, we're getting to that point.
Great, thanks, Pierre. So?
Yeah, I think 2021 was always supposed to be the year where there was going to be vehicles available, and I think that got pushed back because of COVID a little bit and supply chain issues. So I think it's this year when a bunch of different vehicle types will be available, and it's always fun when I can provide guidance to a friend of like, yeah, I like this vehicle, think about this one, you can go to this charging station if you're living in an apartment. And I think that's going to happen more and more, which is, it's a fun conversation to have because everyone in this room and probably most people watching are, more than 99% of the people out there about electric vehicles and such. So it's kind of a fun conversation to have. And when you see people get excited about it, it's fun. So yeah, I think just more people, and then also more people getting into the industry because there's so much work that needs to be done. And so it's going to be nice to have more people to see this cool future that we're creating and want to get involved and then help them learn and then, put the wind behind their sails.
Great. Claire, what are you looking forward to in the next 12 months?
Yeah, my answer is very similar to Zoe's, actually. I was going to say production launches and customer deliveries. I still think one of the biggest barriers to more widespread use of electric commercial vehicles is just availability of those vehicles. And we're going to be launching a number of production programs with our Proterra-powered partners in the coming months and starting a lot of customer deliveries. But broadly, to your point, passenger cars, commercial vehicles, there are a lot more going into production. And so I'm really excited to watch this market grow and become more real.
Great, thanks, Claire. And Justine.
My goodness, I think both Zoe and Claire took mine as well. We've been really excited about vehicle production, particularly in the medium and heavy duty spaces for vehicles. I think that's been something that we've seen as a barrier to some of the uptick in our own program. And so I think, towards the end of last year, we started to see some good momentum building and really excited to see that continue in 2022. I think that helps customers, in developing their concrete plans, knowing when those vehicles are going to show up on site also gives us a better idea of how we need to approach issues regarding capacity and helps reduce some of the uncertainty in planning. And so I think that's a really exciting piece of the industry that I'm looking forward to seeing come into greater fruition this year.
Thank you, Justine. Yeah, and I think to kind of take all of your great predictions for myself and say more conversation around electric commercial vehicles, electric school buses, and electric transit buses in the year ahead. Whether it's more cities in the U.S. kind of following Europe in terms of setting those targets and those long-term planning, charging folks, working together hopefully to help build out the space and hopefully a benefit for both companies such as yourselves within the broader kind of transit and commercial vehicle space, as well as the folks who will be riding those. And hopefully, won't make any predictions about non-electric vehicle-based stuff in terms of more people hopefully riding transit and less pandemic in the year ahead, and that all of us can be together in 12 months in San Francisco or elsewhere for more bnef summits. So with that, just want to thank everyone here. Let's give a round of applause for the panel. And thanks to everyone watching online. We're going to now proceed to a reception out there and some well-deserved beverages, but thanks to all you guys for joining us this whole 2 days. Thank you very much. All right.